Okay, we are live. So welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. I'm going to start in about 50 seconds. Today's text comes from Romans chapter 14, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 6. And we will start in just a little bit. Okay, welcome to those of you who are joining us right now. Progressive Christian Bible Study. We're looking at Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. Basically, we are carrying on from last week's and the week before the lectionary readings from those 2 weeks for this coming Sunday and what we're going to be looking at for today. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to look at, first of all, the 3 P's. The first one is prayer, and this is a prayer I've shared with you over the last couple of weeks, and it comes from Reverend Dr. Marcia Williams. She's the Associate Conference Minister of the New York Conference of the UCC, and this is a prayer that she wrote during the pandemic a few months ago, but I think it's a powerful prayer. Lord, please help me to see you in the face of every human I encounter, to be more faithful in my commitment to my faith community, to be more generous with all that you have blessed me with, to be more patient and loving, to be more kind, to not remain silent in the face of evil or injustice, to just be more like you. Lord, help me to be better tomorrow than I was today. Amen. So that's the first P, prayer. The second is perspective, and today's perspective comes from the field of cultural anthropology. So today's reading from the scriptures that we're going to be looking at comes from Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. And it deals with the issue of what we might refer to as turning minor things into major things. So majoring on minors instead of majoring on majors. And for Paul, majoring on majors means majoring on the principle of love. But what he's found as he's interacted with these Roman Christians is that they are majoring on minor things, things that Paul sees as insignificant. So, for example, Paul talks about rules around food that the Roman Christians have established, and also rules around which days to observe when it comes to religious holidays. And what they've done by highlighting these minor issues is created divisions in their community of faith. Now, Paul is just talking about food and days of observance in Romans 14, but the principle that he's working with is this principle of majoring on majors and minoring on minors. So practically speaking, anytime a community of faith majors on minors, they are, according to Paul, missing out on the major thing, which is the principle of love. So we've all heard stories, or perhaps you've even been part of a church that majors on minors, like, for example, majoring on the kinds of clothes that people ought to wear on a Sunday morning. Now, there's nothing wrong with wearing your Sunday best on a Sunday morning to the church service. However, it becomes a problem if people feel barred from entry because they're not wearing what is socially acceptable. That's a case of majoring on minors. Social codes to observe certain precepts around quote unquote correct behavior might be another example of majoring on minors. And then we can expand this out into the cultural context of feeling pressure to live in only certain kinds of neighborhoods or to get certain kinds of educational degrees. And if you're not part of the groups that live in certain neighborhoods and have access to certain educational degrees, then you're out. And that's really what Paul is getting at. He's getting at who's in and who's out, and what are the rules around defining who's in and who's out. So he's trying to get his readers to major on majors, the major thing being the principle of love, and minor on the minor things. Recognize them as minor and not major. We'll get into this a little bit more in just a moment. So now back to the issue of perspective and cultural anthropology. So um, the things that Paul deals with in Romans 14, they address certain ideas that cultural anthropologists have been dealing with for decades. Things like, how do groups, social groups, demarcate insiders and outsiders? How do they decide who is inside and who is outside? What rules or customs or norms do they create to decide who is in and who is out? And then how do each one of these rules and norms and customs, how do they relate to religion? So, as many of you know, my PhD was in the anthropology of religion. So, I'm especially interested in human behavior. But specifically, I'm interested in what ways do human beings create rules to govern conduct? In what ways do they create these sorts of rules? What do these rules look like? And then how do they link these rules to the quote unquote supernatural? So, for example, groups that say you have to believe this or that in order to be part of this group because God says so. So, you're taking rules and you're linking them up with the supernatural. Or we could talk about other things like we have to be this sort of community and eat these sorts of things and observe these sorts of days and not these other days. And if you can't abide by these rules, then you're out because God says so. So again, you're taking rules and principles, minor things, according to Paul, and you're connecting them up with the supernatural, saying God says so. That's the reason why you have to do it. Or we admit certain people into our community of faith and we bar entry from others because God says so. God says certain people are allowed and other people are not. So you see where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is ultimately springboarding into my understanding of the particular branch of Christianity that I'm ministering, which is progressive Christianity, where we really do strive to major on the majors, striving to major on the principle of love and recognizing minor things as minor things. Now, there's some gray area in there because at what point do you decide this issue has moved from minor to major? Or to put it differently and to make it really concrete, under what conditions might we admit a neo-Nazi into our church? Well, if they're going to continue to live by the principles of hate, then we have to set up a boundary there and say you can't do that here because you're going to be damaging people. However, if you've left behind that that principle of hate and you're trying to live into something else, then yes, you might find a home in our church. So another way to phrase all of this is, in what ways do rules, norms, customs, beliefs get woven together with the supernatural, with the understanding of who God is, and then govern religious or social life? It's a fascinating question to deal with, and cultural anthropologists have been working on this, again, for decades. So one cultural anthropologist in particular who's been working on this, and she's done groundbreaking work on this issue, on this topic, is Mary Douglas. And this is the book that she wrote, that she was made famous for. The book is called Purity and Danger. And she wrote it back in the 1960s. Now, she makes many, many brilliant points in this book, really, again, groundbreaking points. But one of the brilliant points that she makes is that community rules and practices are ways that peoples and cultures deal with ambiguity. Rules and practices are ways that peoples in cultures deal with ambiguity. It helps to establish order on things that otherwise are ambiguous or occupy this space of ambiguity. So one of the things that she writes in this book, Purity and Danger, is this: I believe that ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on an inherently untidy experience. So again, issues, rules, norms, customs around separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing wrongdoers. These have as their main function to impose system on untidiness. Now, one of the things that she does not deal with in her book, she deals with a lot of really interesting examples from across cultures. It's a cross-cultural book. One of the examples she draws from is the book of Leviticus in the Mosaic Law, and she talks about the dietary code in Leviticus. But one of the areas that she doesn't deal with that I find particularly interesting is the issue of creeds or Christian statements of belief. So there are lots of creeds in Christian history, the most famous of which is the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, etc., etc. Has roots in the 4th century and actually even a little bit earlier into the 2nd century in Christian history. But it's the first major creed of a series of creeds that Christians in many branches of Christianity to this day still recite. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed, many, many creeds. Now, anyone who studies Christian history in depth knows that Christians have been all over the map when it comes to matters of doctrine. And there's this false notion that has been infiltrated into Christian memory that says, well, early Christians, the earliest Christians, were all unified. They all believed the same thing. That has proven to be false, in part because the more we learn about early Christianity, the more texts that we discover from early Christianity, the more we realize that early Christianity was every bit as diverse as Christianity is to this day. In fact, some scholars have argued that one particular branch of Christianity, closely linked with a guy named Marcion, may have been just as popular in the 2nd century as what's called proto-Orthodox Christianity, or the Christianity that ultimately won the day as the centuries unwound. So Christianity in the earliest periods was very diverse, just as diverse as what you might find today. But what the creeds did was help to tighten up the boundaries. Again, to use Mary Douglas's words, they imposed system on untidiness. And those of us who study Christian history know that creedal systems imposed order in name only. Because again, the undercurrent underneath the creed that was imposed was very diverse. And Christians have, over the centuries, disagreed constantly over how to articulate precisely the specific micro details of Christian doctrine. So Christian doctrine has been this fluid concept in Christian history. And here's a modern example of this. So recently I was listening to a podcast called Armchair Expert, and the guy who runs it is Dax Shepard. And he was interviewing a minister, Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber. She's a famous author. She was the pastor of a church in Colorado, but she's since become more of an author and speaker. And as he was interviewing her, he asked her about the identity of Jesus. And one of the things she said was that Jesus is not the Son of God. He's God. So she was trying to really emphasize the fact that Jesus is the incarnate God on earth. But she was moving away from this notion of Jesus as Son of God. And that sort of got me thinking that there are some problems with saying that. Perhaps she was just in the rhetorical moment being a little bit sloppy with her language, but to say that Jesus is not the Son of God actually gets us away from one of the historical key points that early Christians were trying to make. And it was a political point. So when early Christians in the New Testament and elsewhere are talking about Jesus as the Son of God, they're not talking about Jesus as the Son of God in the sense of Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. It's too early in Christian history for them to be making that point. It took a couple of centuries for Christians to really start to crystallize notions of Trinity. So when they're talking about Jesus as Son of God, they're speaking in historical and cultural terms. So they're specifically making a political point. So Jesus is the Son of God, which means that Caesar, Augustus in Rome, who is also called Son of God, is not the true Son of God. He's not God's representative on earth. It's this dude, Jesus of Nazareth, who is the representative of God on earth. It's a political statement that they're making. They're basically creating a counterculture to the Roman Empire. So to move away from this notion of Son of God, as Nadia Bolz-Weber does, at least in that podcast, she did that, is to get us into troubled waters when it comes to the history of early Christianity. Now, I'm a Christian. She's a Christian. We're both ministers. But when it comes to this particular phrase, Son of God, we seem to be moving in different directions. It's just an example of how when you get down into the micro details, the weeds of Christian quote unquote doctrine, you can find a lot of diversity. So now back to Mary Douglas and this second P, perspective. So I'm going to quote again from her. I believe that ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on untidiness. So a creed, of course, systematizes the untidiness of Christian belief, or at least tries to, ostensibly tries to. It imposes order on untidiness. Now, Mary Douglas, elsewhere in her book, Purity and Danger, she talks about rules and precepts and beliefs and practices that try to tighten up the porous boundaries of a social body. She actually uses an analogy of the physical body. She likens it to the social body. And then she probes a series of cultures which deal with the issue of boundaries and the issue of body. And so what she's interested in part, is what do cultures do with, say, saliva? So one of the things I used to do when I taught Introduction to the Study of Religion at the college level is I would show an example of, saliva. Someone has saliva in their mouth, it's considered clean. But all of a sudden, when you spit it, it becomes unclean. And would you take something that's been spit and then put it back in your mouth? Even though it's still saliva, why wouldn't you do that? Well, because it's crossed some kind of boundary and it's gone from clean to unclean. And so Mary Douglas actually uses that, among other things, as an example of the porousness of the body and how we set up rules and principles and cultural norms in order to police those boundaries. Again, to try to bring order to untidiness. And in this case, saliva represents untidiness. So this is some profound ideas that she has, and they apply across cultures. It makes her writing really provocative and useful when we're getting into a text like Romans 14, which talks about the body. This is the body of Christ, the church. And Paul's dealing with how these early Christians have majored on minor issues. They're trying to really cramp down and police the body of the church. But he's trying to get them to major on the majors, to set a different kind of boundary, so to speak, and to emphasize this principle of love. So this brings us to today's reading. And again, it's from Romans 14, and it's verses 1 through 6 that we're going to be looking at, and I will read it. So here's what Paul says. Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Notice where he's going here. First thing he says is quarreling over opinions. So he's immediately classifying the kinds of things that they're disputing over as minor issues. These are not major things. They're quarreling over opinions. So he goes on. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. Also, those who eat, eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God, while those who abstain, abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. So what he's doing, in effect, here is relativizing the minor issues that these guys have been majoring on. The issues of food, the issues of observing certain days instead of others. And these are just cases in point that could be expanded out and to include any situation in the church or in a social group where there's an insistence on majoring on minors, things that aren't actually that important in the grand scheme of things. And what Paul is trying to do is to get them to move beyond this into majoring on majors. And in fact, after today's section, in the next major section in Romans 14, one of the things that Paul talks about is walking in love. That's actually the phrase that he uses. That's the principle that we're trying to abide by, walking in love. That's to major on the majors instead of majoring on the minors. Now, I want to go into the context around these verses that I just read. And this is what I've done the last 2 weeks. And one of the reasons why I like to do this is because the book of Romans is a complicated letter. It's huge, first of all. It's 16 chapters, and it's super dense. It's like entering into this thick forest where any verse could get you bogged down in all sorts of weeds. So it's important to step back for a moment and look at the broad sweep in terms of context around the verses that we looked at. And one of the first things to recognize in all of Paul's letters is that his primary audience always is Gentile Christians. So in the letter to the Romans, there are most likely ethnic Jews who are also followers of Jesus, who are part of Paul's quote unquote audience. That is his first readers, or in fact, his first hearers, because most likely the letter to the Romans, as with every New Testament book, was read aloud to church members, because most people in the ancient world were in fact illiterate. So most likely his first audience, his first hearers, would have included both Jews and Gentiles, at least in Romans. However, when Paul writes, because in other places in his letters, he talks about himself being the apostle to the Gentiles, his primary audience, when he talks about anything, whether it's the Jewish law, the cross of Christ, sin, ethics, whatever he talks about, grace, his primary audience is Gentile Christians. And that is probably the most important point that can be made when we're talking about reading the letters of Paul, in part because so much of Christian history has taken Paul's letters, specifically the negative things that he says about the Jewish law, and tried to universalize them in order to make them apply to both Jews and Gentiles. And that leads us down the path of both anti-Judaism and ultimately anti-Semitism. And Christian history is riddled with examples of Christians abusing Jews because they're misusing the letters of Paul and not understanding this fundamental insight that his primary audience is always Gentile Christians. So we step back and look structurally at the letter, and the context just prior to Romans 14 is what we looked at last week, Romans 13. And there Paul talks about love fulfilling law. One of the things he does that's really interesting in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, is he only quotes 4 precepts from the Decalogue, from the 10 Commandments. And the precepts that he quotes are the ones that happen to be the most universal in applicability. They're ones that you can find across cultures. So he deliberately does not cite, say, keep the Sabbath day, because that's primarily a Jewish law, something that Jews would have observed. But he does cite things like don't murder and don't steal. And they have a much broader applicability across cultures. And one of the reasons why I think he does this in Romans 13 is because the point he's trying to make is that love is the major issue. When you want to major on the majors, you major on love, because love fulfills law. And that's every law. It's not just the Decalogue, the Mosaic law. It's every law has as its ideal, or ought to have as its ideal, this principle of love. So that's Romans 13. And then just prior to Romans 13, and we looked at this 2 weeks ago in Romans chapter 12, Paul lists a whole bunch of traits of what genuine love looks like. Things like abhorring what is evil, clinging to what is good, honoring one another before you honor yourself, being hopeful and patient and prayerful, helpful and caring of those in the church, loving your enemies, living in harmony. Don't judge. A whole list of things that he says are traits of genuine love. So in Romans 13, he says love fulfills law. In Romans 12, he talks about what genuine love looks like. And then in Romans 14, he gets really specific, and he deals with an issue that's going on in these Roman congregations. And I use congregations in the plural because most likely we're not dealing with a single church in Rome that Paul is writing this letter to, probably a group of churches. Rome was a fairly large city, and this letter would have been brought to each one of these congregations and read aloud to them. But one issue that seems to be going on there is that there's this friction between people groups around issues like food and around issues like which days to honor in terms of religious observance. And I'll get into that in just a second. So we step back even a little further and we look at the bigger context of the letter to the Romans. And I've talked about this now for the past 2 weeks, but it's important to keep in mind. Paul organizes the letter to the Romans, as he does with the letter to the Galatians, according to the structure of a good speech in antiquity, according to the structure of classical rhetoric, or the highlights of classical rhetoric in terms of a speech. So you can imagine this letter being read aloud, and the audience, fairly familiar with a rhetorical speech, would have said, oh yeah, that's the exordium, that's the introduction. Oh yeah, that's the narratio, that's the background of what Paul is getting at here. They're hearing this being read aloud. It's like a speech, even though it's written down. Oh yeah, that's the propositio, that's the thesis. They would have gotten this. Oh yeah, these are the proofs that demonstrate the validity of the thesis. Oh yeah, that's the peroratio, that's the ending of the letter, but it ends on this emotional appeal note. And there Paul is talking about his desire to visit these Roman congregations and then move on from there into Spain, further westward, because again, he sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. So this first audience, in hearing this letter being read aloud, would have gotten it. Oh yeah, that's that. This is like a speech. And they would have expected at the end, peroratio, some emotional appeal, which they get in Romans chapter 15. Now, the thesis of the letter, and I've said this over the last 2 weeks, but the thesis comes in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God for salvation for all who have faith. The just shall live by faith. So he hits all the key themes that he wants to develop in the letter, one of the key themes being this issue of faith. But again, always keep in mind, when Paul writes to these early Christian congregations, his primary audience is Gentile Christians. Even if there might be ethnic Jews in these congregations, they're sort of listening in on a conversation that Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, is having with Gentile Christians. One of the reasons why that's important, incidentally, Paul develops in chapters 9 through 11 in the letter to the Romans, because at the end of that section in chapter 11, Paul talks about all Israel being saved. He makes no distinction there, so he doesn't tie Israel or Jewish salvation to the issues of faith that he has been developing in the letter. He sees the people of Israel as having their own covenant arrangement with God, and Gentiles have a separate covenant arrangement with God, which is why in the letter to the Galatians, Paul talks about two separate gospels. One is an announcement to Jews, and the other is an announcement to Gentiles. Just a couple of allusions to this that he makes in Galatians, but it's super important because the tendency in Christian history, and certainly in modern Christianity, has been to collapse it all into a single gospel. But Paul actually splits it apart, the gospel for the Jews and the gospel for the Gentiles. He sees two separate pathways here. And he develops this again in chapters 9 through 11 in Romans. So the thesis is chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, and then Paul lays out a series of proofs in the rest of the letter, where he talks about issues of faith. He talks about the relationship between Christ's cross and the salvation of humanity. He talks about the Spirit of God in Romans chapter 8, how the Spirit actually prays for us and grieves as we're all waiting for creation to be redeemed. So he has this cosmic vision of salvation. And then in chapters 9 through 11, he deals with the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, which was an issue in Rome among these Roman congregations. And then in chapters 12, 13, and 14, Paul starts to get more concrete, and he really elevates this principle of love as the way to major on majors in the church, but also in society. He's not just limiting himself to speaking about what goes on in the church, although that's his primary interest. The principle of love applies much more broadly than just the confines of a church community or a church building. And then in chapter 14, he gets really concrete when talking about majoring on this principle of love. And he's trying to identify those issues that these Roman Christians have been majoring on, but really are minor issues like food and daily observance of certain days. These are minor issues that are dividing you guys up when what you ought to be focusing on is this bigger issue of living according to the principle of love. So another way to think about this, along the lines of what Mary Douglas talks about, is that love becomes the organizing principle that establishes order in the midst of chaos or disunity. Love is the overarching principle, not food laws or daily observance of certain customs. Love is actually the principle. Okay, so that brings us back into today's reading. Again, it's verses 1 through 6. I'm going to reread them and then highlight a few points. So Paul says, "Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day observe it in honor of the Lord. Also those who eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God. While those who abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God." I'm going to skip ahead and read one more verse, verse 15. "If your brother or sister is being injured by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love." Now, that's an interesting phrase. If your brother or sister is being injured by what you eat. Now, Paul does not have in mind here cooking and food poisoning. So that, if you cook for your brother or sister, which is a euphemism for other people in the congregation or in the church, if you cook for them and they get sick, that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about food poisoning as the way to do damage to another. He's talking about elevating certain dietary rules, making these minor issues major issues that then divide the community between those who eat and those who abstain. And those who eat, he says, don't despise those who abstain, and those who abstain don't judge those who eat. So he's, in a way, relativizing the principles that these Roman Christians have been trying to live by, these minor issues that they have been majoring on. He's relativizing them and says, let each person be fully convinced in their own mind. If it's a big deal for you, then it's a big deal for you, and that's okay. Continue to live into it, but don't try to impose that on someone else. Would that some of our conservative Christian brothers and sisters abided by this principle. They're trying to take sometimes minor issues and universalizing them and imposing them on others. But that is to contravene what Paul is getting at here. So in verse 1, he talks about those who are, quote unquote, weak in faith. Now, this is a very unfortunate word that he uses, this word weak. So he's linking up those who are weak in faith with those who have a really restrictive diet, those who eat only vegetables. They're the ones who are weak in faith, while the strong are the ones who eat anything. That's problematic because the word weak it sort of degrades and in a way even might damage those for whom eating vegetables is a big deal, the vegetarians in their midst. But what I think he's doing here is he's using words that the Roman Christians themselves are using when they're arguing with each other. So some groups are accusing others of being weak in faith, and others are accusing them of being, well, you claim to be strong in faith because you're eating anything. So these are words that are getting tossed around. These are categories that are getting tossed around. And so Paul is simply picking up on the discourse that's already existing in these Roman congregations. But one of the reasons why this is effective rhetorically is because it tells these Roman Christians that Paul knows what they're saying about each other. It immediately gives him a little inroad into this discourse. It lets them know that he knows what's going on. He's even willing to use the words that they're using amongst themselves. So again, he says the weak eat only vegetables. Now, I think what he's doing here is he's going beyond what, in fact, the weak were emphasizing, quote unquote, weak were emphasizing when it comes to diet. They probably weren't just eating vegetables. Paul's saying they're only eating vegetables, or in fact, literally, it could be translated as they're only eating lettuce, to even restrict it further. So he's trying to highlight just how restrictive they're being, even though in actual practice, they probably weren't being that restrictive. He's being hyperbolic here. And likewise, when he's talking about the quote unquote strong, they eat anything. Well, they don't eat anything. They just have a broader notion of diet than the quote unquote weak Christians do. But he's polarizing them in order to relativize the things that are dividing them. Now, one of the problems in Christian history has been to link up the weak in faith, those who eat only vegetables, with Jews, and the strong in faith, who eat anything, with Gentiles, and to make the issue of kosher diet the issue that these two groups are arguing over. Now, that is problematic for many reasons, but one of the most obvious reasons is if you go back and read verses 1 through 6, Paul doesn't indicate in any way whatsoever that one group is Jewish and the other group is not. So that's being imposed onto the text. And then in Protestant Catholic discourse, the weak and the strong has been transmuted into the weak are the Catholics who have all these rituals and stuff, and the strong are the Protestants. So particularly Protestants are the ones who have been trying to co-opt Paul's language and impose it on Catholic Protestant debates. But of course, Catholics and Protestants didn't exist when Paul wrote in the first century. It's not even a valid implication from what he's talking about here. So it's good to understand that Paul's being hyperbolic in his language in this passage. Those who only eat vegetables, that's hyperbole. Those who eat anything, that's hyperbole. Those who observe one day over the others, he's being hyperbolic. He's not specifically targeting Jews. He's targeting anyone who's going to make an issue of a minor thing and make it such an issue that they're going to judge someone else for not keeping to their moral precepts. And he's also going to target those who are going to condescend and denigrate those who do have a more restrictive understanding of things. He doesn't want them to major on minor things. He doesn't want them to fight with each other. He wants them to move beyond this, to major on the major thing, which is loving another. So what he says is those who eat, in verse 3, should not despise those who don't, and those who don't shouldn't judge those who do. So he's trying to build a community ethic here that is non-judgmental and that treats each person as a human being with different understandings of how they're going to live out their life of faith and not judge each other for that. But he is trying to foster a diverse community here. And those of us in the United Church of Christ, the UCC, always recognize the validity and the value in a diverse community. Those of us who are Congregationalists recognize that you can't impose creedal orthodoxy on a Congregational church, just like you can't impose certain food understandings or certain day understandings on a congregation. The congregation itself is going to have diversity of expression when it comes to understandings of faith. But the thing that I'm interested in with Paul's language here is how it segues very nicely into an understanding of progressive Christianity and how we live as progressive Christians. We don't judge. We don't despise another person. We really do strive to major on the majors and minor on the minors, to recognize certain things as minor issues but then to elevate the major principle, which is the principle of love. Make love your governing principle is another way to phrase all of what Paul talks about in chapters 12, 13, and 14 of the letter to the Romans. And as I mentioned a second ago, in Romans chapter 14, a little bit after the verses that we looked at for today, he talks about walking in love, making this the governing principle. So if we were to go back one final time to Mary Douglas, and here she's talking about in that quote that I read a couple of times to you, she's talking about all of the issues that separate and emphasize purity and demarcate people and talk about punishing certain people instead of others. All of those issues, she says, have as their main function to impose system on untidiness. Well, what Paul does is he, in a way, celebrates the untidiness of these Roman congregations, that some are going to do certain things with diet, some are going to do certain things with observing certain days. But what he wants them to do is to move even bigger, to become bigger in their understanding of faith, and not so narrowly focused on minor issues, but to major on this major issue of living into love. Okay, see you next week. Actually, I won't see you next week. I'm off next week. I'll see you in 2 weeks.